And too much of doing good in the world is this like thinly disguised paternalism that says, I know better than you do. One of the most damaging stories in the world. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish, you feed him for a lifetime. I think that it's not widely understood that there are hundreds of people in the world who could, through their personal decision, choose to end poverty in a country.
Welcome back to Humans in the Loop. Today, we're going to be talking about philanthropy, and I'm joined by Nick Allardice, who's had an illustrious career across nonprofit and social action, notably as a CEO of Change.org and now as CEO and president of GiveDirectly. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Seb.
So let's maybe kick things off with GiveDirectly. How would you describe what GiveDirectly is and what it does?
GiveDirectly sends money to people in poverty and crisis. It's pretty simple, but you can think of GiveDirectly as maybe an organization in three parts. Part one is we're a fintech organization. We're a fintech company. We build technology to find and reach and send money to people in some of the hardest to reach places in the world as efficiently as possible. And so we have a reasonably sized tech team. We kind of spend a lot of time thinking about cross-border payments and kind of targeting and various things. So we're one part technology company. We're one part economics research institute. GiveDirectly really exists because a bunch of economics research 15, 20 years ago started figuring out that cash transfers worked surprisingly well. And so we have done a bunch of studies over the years, and we're extremely data-driven. We're founded by a bunch of economists to basically understand how does injecting cash and capital to individuals at particular moments in time work, what outcomes does it drive, what doesn't it drive, and how do we do it better? So that's the second thing we do. And the third is that we're a philanthropic organization. We're a philanthropic advisory group in some ways. We've had more than 150,000 donors over the years. We've moved more than $1 billion. We work with people who are giving $50 at a time and people that are giving $50 million at a time to figure out how they can have the most impact with their dollars. And so take all of those things, mix them all together, shake it up a bit, and that's what you get when you get GiveDirectly.
Amazing. How is it you find the people who need the cash first and foremost? And I guess once you've found them, how do you decide how much money to give them?
So there's really two contexts in which we are finding people. The first context is people who are living in extreme poverty. And for those folks, we use a mixture of government data, poverty statistics. We use satellite imagery to identify communities of particularly like high poverty based on how buildings are constructed. We sometimes use mobile phone data, and we basically combine all of these different data points together to identify communities that have really high rates of extreme poverty. And just to give a moment of context, extreme poverty is living on less than $3 a day. And there's about 800 million people who live under the extreme poverty line. And that line is set as the kind of measure of what's the minimum you need to get your most basic needs met. So if you're under that line, it means that you might be eating one meal a day and not having very good nutrition in that one meal. It means having to make hard, really impossible choices between my kid's sick and I need to buy medicine for them. But if I do so, it means that the whole family goes hungry for 2 days. It means having to trade off, like having your kids work on a farm or go to school. And so the extreme poverty line is like the most basic needs that you need to kind of get your needs met. And we take all of those data points that I was describing to identify communities where really high rates of extreme poverty exist. like 80%, 85% of the communities in extreme poverty. And once we identify them, we come in and we basically give every single person in that community a one-time cash transfer that is designed to catalyze them out of extreme poverty in an ongoing way without additional support from us. So that's one context in which we're finding people. The second context in which we're finding people is in emergencies. So this is like a natural disaster has hit somewhere, or say like conflict has broken out. People have had to flee their homes. And in that context, we are looking for people that are sitting at the intersection of poverty and crisis. And so in those situations, we're often using big machine learning models on telco data. So we partner and integrate deeply with telecommunication companies to be able to identify people that might be fleeing conflicts. Like they might be in a community, it's been attacked, and we're able to see through the telco data that there's a certain set of people that are on the run based on the movement of their cell phones. And we're able to predict what level of vulnerability do those people have based on the usage of those cell phones. Because if you're living on $3 a day versus $10 a day, you actually use your cell phone in a different way. And so we're able to kind of take some of that data, run machine learning models over it in order to kind of predict who needs support, and then we reach out to them and we're there to help them. And so they're the ways that we work.
Yeah, and I guess as you're describing that, I, like perhaps many people listening, the images that will spring to mind might be of war-torn countries in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. But I want to kind of check myself there. I mean, when we're talking about these communities, I know they exist in those parts of the world. But are you also serving communities? I know you're based in New York. I'm here in France, in Europe. Are you also kind of serving or identifying any of those kinds of communities in countries that people would think of as being the kind of so-called developed world?
Yeah, we disproportionately, so the most of our poverty-focused work is in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have really high concentrations of this like extreme poverty. But our crisis work is around the world. And so when there is an emergency, no matter where it is, we will look for people who are at that intersection of high vulnerability for the context in which they are in. And so that can include developed countries. We actually do a lot of emergency response in the US. That includes middle income countries. We responded to a hurricane in Jamaica a few months ago, and then also the high poverty countries as well.
I'm interested to sort of double click on, you mentioned the three parts of the company, the sort of technology company, research institute, and then the sort of philanthropic arm. If we look at the technology company part of GiveDirectly for a minute, I, as someone in a former life, worked in fintech and spent many a head-scratching afternoon figuring out how to move money around the world. So, like, I know that's a pretty complicated task at the best of times, and imagine even more so in the parts of the world that you're covering and the situations that you're covering. So yeah, I mean, tell me a little bit more about that. When you're identifying these communities and you're going and you talk about them receiving cash. I mean, is that a kind of, here's a wedge of cash in a brown paper envelope, go and do with it what you will? Or like, how does the money get from A to B?
Yeah. GiveDirectly really is, we're 15 years old, and we really exist because of this big macro breakthrough of mobile money in the developing world. And so going back to the early 2010s, you essentially have this explosion in places like Kenya of things like M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a kind of company product that, or at least a product that is of the telcos there, where for the first time people became banked through their phone. And so for those of us in the developed world, this is like a PayPal wallet or a Venmo wallet or something like this, except it's on a dumb phone. It's on like one of those really old Nokias that many of us grew up with, although maybe I'm showing my age. And so starting about 15, 20 years ago, you have hundreds of millions of people who have never had a bank account for their entire lives. They've been entirely unbanked, get mobile phones for the first time, and on those mobile phones get access to essentially a bank account, which is this mobile money account. And so for the first time ever, it becomes possible to reach people directly, purely digitally, via technology. And so we never work with physical cash, it's all digital cash. And so from a technology perspective, our stack has to include cross-border transfers, deduplication and verification at a kind of national level, a bunch of fraud protection, but then integration with a whole lot of mobile money providers, so that we can essentially move money from our bank account in New York all the way to an individual in rural Malawi or Rwanda or the Democratic Republic of Congo, and be able to kind of track that end to end with high confidence verification, auditability, all of those things. And so, we do everything from a lot of verification technology and anti-fraud stuff, cross-border payments. We do a bunch of work actually with stablecoins at the moment because that helps us move money particularly quickly in the context of crisis. And that's the kind of stuff that we're working on.
Yeah, it's. I guess they say that necessity is the mother of all invention. Like I'm always struck. My mum is from Zimbabwe. I've spent quite a lot of time in sort of southern Africa and parts of it, and it always strikes me as kind of amazing that things like M-Pesa have existed on this very rudimentary technology foundation for decades. Like we in countries like France or the US are kind of probably still still struggling sometimes day to day with like the movement of money, and it's just like existed in this part of the world that people do not necessarily think of as like technology forward for so much longer than we give it credit for.
But I think it's a really good example of leapfrogging. It's this idea that some technologies come along that allow you to leapfrog other phases of technology that other like countries have essentially navigated. And so for many people in these countries, like there will never be a need for a bank account because M-Pesa and mobile money essentially becomes that for them. And so they're able to leapfrog that. Similarly, most of these communities totally leapfrogged desktop computers. Like no need for them whatsoever, go straight to the mobile revolution. And I think that those types of transformative technologies that allow societies that are still kind of lagging a little bit to leapfrog previously what developed societies had done, sometimes allows them to catch up and innovate in ways that previously, like that we're still struggling with.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about how the money actually reaches them. The end use of the money, as it were, the way that they then decide to invest that money. I imagine that the options there are just too varied to name. But yeah, what visibility of what involvement do you have in, I guess, how the money is eventually spent, or is it just a no strings attached, here you go kind of donation?
It's no strings attached, and there's two reasons for that. Number one, the research that we've done is that actually works better. And I can say a little bit more about why in a moment. But that's the first reason. And then the second reason, which is just as important, is at a values level. We think that there's something incredibly important from a dignity and power perspective in saying you are the one to make the impossible choice, not us. Because the more that we or any organization says, you should spend on this, or this is how you should use the money, the more we are putting ourselves in their position to kind of make these really impossible choices. When if you had to trade off between making an elderly parent slightly more comfortable and kind of providing care for them in the later stages of their life, and investing in a business for today, or being slightly more comfortable today, or having your kid go to extra school, like what's the right choice there? I don't think there is one. That is a values question at its most fundamental. And so like I can't say with confidence what is the right answer for those types of choices, but what I can say is who gets to decide? And I don't think I should decide that. I don't think you should decide that. I think the person who is having to navigate that choice is the only one who should. And too much of, I guess, like doing good in the world is this like thinly disguised paternalism that says, I know better than you do. And so we kind of believe that both at an evidentiary level, we think it actually has more impact, and there's good evidence to show that, but also at a values level. And the evidence one, I think, is really interesting, though, because it's kind of counterintuitive for many people that, like, surely people don't know how to use this money. We should probably provide guidance or restrictions. Aren't they all going to drink it away? That's very normal. And so most of the evidence at this point is extremely clear. First of all, people are extremely creative. I'm going to give you an example here. I came across a woman a few months ago, someone who received money from us. She's like in her 70s. And when she got her cash transfer, she invested it in a 10,000 gallon water tank. And this is a giant water tank. And she spent the vast majority of her money on it. She pays to get that filled with clean water every 2 weeks. And then she resells that water to her community at a small margin. And so now she has access to clean water. She was previously walking 5 to 10 kilometers a day in order to go and pick up clean water just for herself in her 70s. And now she has like this 10,000 gallon water tank that she's reselling to her community. And so not only is she a provider of clean water to her community, but she's earning a small margin on top of that and able to then like reinvest that and look after herself better. Now, there is no nonprofit in the world that would be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to provide 10,000 gallon water tanks to elderly women in Western Kenya. It's lunacy. And yet, like, her creativity, her ability to kind of look at her community and say, what's appropriate for my situation? What can I do that no one else can? What's a need that my community has that like no one else has? Is unmatched. And so she has the most information. She has all of the incentive to use that money as creatively as she possibly can. And so our ability in some top-down method to kind of identify what is the best use of that money, I think is all the evidence says is actually just not as good as her making that choice for herself, which doesn't mean that she'll always get it right. There will be people who fail. There will be people who like try something and it doesn't work out, and that will be devastating. But what I can say with confidence is that it's going to succeed at a higher rate than if we tried to do it for them.
Yeah. That paternal tendency, shall we say, it kind of takes me back in my younger days. Actually, I studied economics, and I studied a branch of development economics in particular. And I remember vividly being kind of slapped down in a loving way, but by a professor based on a comment I'd made, which to me at the time, 18, 19-year-old me felt very well intentioned and innocent. I can't even remember the contents of the comment. And I remember her immediately sort of saying, well, don't you think that's a bit paternalistic? And I was like, it's the first time, like, oh yeah, I suppose it is. I suppose I am like making this assumption that like somehow I know better or am smarter or whatever, can figure out the situation. And so, yeah, I guess that value you touch on about just ultimately trusting the person who is in the situation to make the best decision for them seems like a pretty powerful one.
It is, and it's very counterintuitive. I think we all have the best of intentions. People who, have empathy and want to do the best, like it comes from a good place. It comes from I don't want to see the money wasted, and like, do people really know what's best for them, and so on and so. So it comes from a good place. I have empathy for that, but
of course,
all of the evidence at this point is that it's just like very misguided.
Yeah. Beyond this, I imagine there are many individual incredible stories. If we zoom out and think kind of macro impact for a minute, I read about an experiment that you were running in Malawi, I believe, that was more of a kind of, can you lift a whole country or a whole mass community out of poverty in sort of one felt swoop? So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we have started as an organization thinking of cash transfers almost as an individual intervention, where we identify individual people, transfer money to them, catalyze them out of poverty, and then they sustain that. We didn't talk earlier about, I realized I didn't answer your question about the size of the cash transfer, but to give a little bit of context on that, because I think it's important, we transfer about $550 per individual. And that is the equivalent of about like 12 to 18 months worth of income. So it's like a very substantial cash infusion for their level of income. And the reason that it's that size is that's enough for them to get their most basic needs met, like urgent healthcare needs, food security, etc. But then it's enough for them to then have a substantial amount left over to make some sort of large productive investment. What is that productive investment? Varies widely. It could be the 10,000 gallon water tank. It could be a farm. It could be a barbershop, but it's some sort of investment that generates ongoing return. And so we size the amounts that we transfer to allow them to get their most basic needs met in an immediate sense, and then make a significant productive investment that is then going to generate a long-term return. Because we only ever come once. We come and we say, we're giving you this $550. This is your chance. Don't screw it up. Like, think really carefully, because we're never going to come back, because we don't want to breed dependency. We think that there's like much better evidence actually for these one-time cash transfers than ongoing cash transfers. And so that is the core of the model. Now, in Malawi, though, we have started to understand that cash transfers are not just about the individual. They're about the impact on the wider community around them. And so starting, we had a big study, a randomized controlled trial. This is like a big A/B test that is done by development economists, that the results came out a few years ago that showed that the general equilibrium effects, which is essentially the economy-wide effects of a cash transfer, are like even more significant than just the transfer to the individual. And so what we found is for every $1 that went in, $2.50 circulated in the local economy, and people who were nearby, who didn't receive cash, but who were within, say, like 30 minutes of someone who did receive cash, benefited almost as much, like 80 or 90% as much as the person who did receive the cash transfer, because of the way in which people then spent locally. They bought goods, they hired people, they did all these different things, and it's that economy-wide infusion that actually ends up having most of the most dramatic effects. And so in Malawi, that caused us to answer the question, well, what happens if we start doing this at like greater and greater scale? And so we focused on a sub-district. This was 75,000 adults, and we transferred cash to them over the course of 6 months. This was a huge cash infusion. It was like the equivalent of more than doubling local GDP in the space of 6 months. We did this for a couple of reasons. We wanted to measure these economy-wide effects. We also wanted to make sure we understood, were we driving inflation? Could we put in place protections to ensure that inflation wasn't happening as a result of that level of injection? And so the results of this were really interesting. So 12 months later from this one-time transfer, the proportion of people above the poverty line more than doubled. So it went from 36% of people above the poverty line to 79% of people above the poverty line. And even for those below the poverty line, their living standard tripled. So they went from, say, like living on 71 cents a day to $2.10 or $2.20 a day. And so even if they didn't cross the poverty line of $3 a day, the standard of living still went substantially up. And so that is the thing that like gives us the most excitement. It is the level of impact to have like this like crazy number of people catalyzed out of poverty, the poorest living much better than they once were. And we were measuring inflation, and there was no inflation over the course of this 12 months. And that's a pretty counterintuitive result. If you're kind of an economics nerd, you might expect that doubling local GDP might drive inflation, but it turns out that in these economies, there's a lot of latent supply that is not being utilized on a regular basis. There's a lot of what's called slack in the economy, where, say, a mechanic is doing one job a week and the rest of the time sitting idle. And so when you have this big injection of capital, the mechanic can take on another 25 jobs a week without needing to hire more people or to kind of increase prices or anything like that. And so these economies are actually like quite well suited to this type of intervention, because they can absorb and utilize all of this extra cash that's floating around.
And what does, you talked about the kind of the individual level cash transfer, and then there's this sort of community-based, larger scale. It sounds like an experiment that sounds very successful in terms of the impacts that have been measured so far. What does cash transfer kind of not solve for. There's almost one can kind of like look at the evidence of all of this and sort of think, well, if it's that simple, right? If we just need to put cash in the hands of people and it like solves all these problems, it's like, why does anything else philanthropically even exist? Should it not just all be cash transfer?
I think a lot of interventions shouldn't exist and should be replaced by cash. That said, there are a set of things that cash transfers just won't achieve. Public goods, in particular, are unlikely to be driven by cash transfers. And so cash will have the greatest impact where there is some degree of functioning healthcare system. It will have the greatest impact when there is some degree of infrastructure that allows people to move between towns and cities. So roads. Cash is not going to build a functioning school system. And so there are public goods that I think it is like really important to keep investing in, because cash amplifies their effects. It makes people like more successful within that environment. And where they don't exist, cash will have less impact. Cash will still have a significant impact, but it will have less of an impact. And so, I'm a big supporter. I'm never going to say that cash is a silver bullet that will solve everything. That I'm a big believer in investing in particular, healthcare systems and public infrastructure that unlocks markets. Like, they're the things that I think we still need to do a lot of. But on the whole, I think there's an extraordinary number of well-intentioned but ultimately totally ineffective kind of interventions out there that sound good in theory, but in practice either don't have impact or have less impact than just spending that money on a cash transfer. One of the most damaging stories in the world is the idea that this metaphor, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man a fish, you feed him for a lifetime. It sounds so intuitively attractive. And yet, all of the evidence at this point says, number one, most people don't want to be fishermen. In a market economy, you need a mixture of, probably need one or two fishermen, but you also need some taxi drivers. You also need some bakers. And so the likelihood that any one central organization is going to effectively map and identify what are the needs in any one community is like close to zero. And so our ability to centrally plan local economies, I think we should have high degrees of skepticism of, but that's what that story implies we should do. The second thing is our ability to teach people stuff is actually pretty bad. Study after study shows that you kind of teach people to fish, and then 6 months later, they retain none of it and behavior hasn't changed. And so even if you believed that we could centrally plan what roles you need in a community, our ability to effectively teach people is actually really poor. And so study after study at this point shows, those types of vocational training programs that make so much intuitive sense and that seem so attractive just don't work as effectively as take whatever it would cost to deliver those programs and just give it to people as unconditional cash, and they know what to do. They will get greater bang for buck.
Yeah. That does seems like an important thing to dispel based on that evidence. I was in preparing for this episode. Perhaps it's the algorithms know that I was particularly interested in GiveDirectly. But one of the things that sprung to my attention, came up on some feed somewhere, was a video by Rutger Bregman, who, for those not familiar, I think his sort of academic background is a sort of economic historian. You might have come across him on social media. He's a pretty outspoken guy, loves to rage bait billionaires at things like Davos for, not paying enough tax and for global inequality and for, flying their private jets in to an event that's talking about climate issues. So he's a lively character, shall we say. Anyway, in this video, he was talking about global inequality, and I've, there are various statistics that float out there, but I guess something like the top 1% of the world's richest hold something like 50% of the world's wealth. Depending how you slice the pie, the figures can differ, but I guess the sentiment is the same. What he says in this video, and I'm not sure if you've come across it, but he says something like, well, it's frustrating because we have the solutions for solving this already. If only, the world's billionaires would pick up the phone to Nick Allardice of GiveDirectly and start funneling money that way. We could solve the problem. So I'm curious. Well, firstly, had you come across Rutger Bregman's that statement, and B, are those phone calls forthcoming from those who are holding large amounts of wealth?
I know Rutger, he's a great guy, and I appreciated the shout out that he gave us, because I think that it's not widely understood that there are hundreds of people in the world who could, through their personal decision, choose to end poverty in a country. Like it's kind of a mind-blowing idea when you stop to think about it. But like our best estimate is that in Malawi, as an example, this is a country of 21 million people. It's the poorest peaceful country on earth. It would cost $6 or $7 billion to not fully eliminate, but for the vast majority of people in the country, like lift them above that $3 line. Which, to be clear, is not the same thing as saying we know how to solve economic growth. Because like at the end of the day, like the thing that is going to sustainably like lift people's living standards over time is going to be economic growth, in the likes of which we've seen over the last 50 years in Southeast Asia, in China, in India, which have together like collectively lifted like billions of people out of poverty. So I think the world of economists like is still trying to figure out what's the magic formula for that. But we do know how to sustainably lift people above that $3 line. And the difference between living on 70 cents a day and $3 a day is like unimaginable for those of us in the global north. It's like getting people where there is a basic standard of living where you don't go to bed hungry, where you don't have to make choices between getting healthcare for your kid or sending them to school, is like something that is eminently achievable. And there are hundreds of people who can decide to do that for tens of millions of people at a time. And so I appreciated Rutger kind of putting that word out there. I don't think that's widely understood. I see it as partially my role and the role of GiveDirectly to give folks that have that level of opportunity, wealth, and success a credible pathway to doing extraordinary amounts of good. And I am somewhat optimistic that that is going to increasingly happen over time. We work with some of the wealthiest people in the world. None of them are signing billion-dollar checks yet, but like certainly like we've had in the hundreds of millions. And part of our work in Malawi, this effort to kind of concentrate our focus in like a sub-district, and now we're actually moving to a district at the moment. We have almost a $200 million project that is all about having that credible pathway to saying, no, we can effectively deploy in the billions of dollars quickly, efficiently, with high confidence, knowing exactly what they're going to do. We've managed all of the negative externalities that might come from it. And we can be a place that people can confidently spend that kind of money to have the type of legacy that is like extraordinary impact for tens of millions of people. And in a time in which there is more wealth being created than at any time in human history, I think that, I hope that we as a community of humans on this planet can use that extraordinary wealth to lift the floor of people's experience.
Yeah, I was curious as you were saying that. I was like, I wonder what the number, what ballpark we'd be in. I wouldn't even be able to sort of pull a guess out of the air. And of course, 6-7 billion is a huge sum of money, but in the grand scheme of global wealth, I'm not sure if you sort of stack that up versus the list of the world's wealthiest, how far down that list you'd go bit before you sort of hit the cutoff. But certainly, if we think of tech, many people listening to this podcast will probably be in and around that industry. Certainly the big figures in tech are not just north of that line, but north of that line by orders and orders and orders of magnitude in many cases. I know you can't sort of name names, nor would I expect you to. But have you had? You said nobody has yet written the $1 billion checks, but have you had anyone come to you with the aspiration, with the kind of, hey Nick, what would it take? I've got the money. What would it take me to give to actually take a whole country or whatever the unit is and lift everybody out of poverty?
Yeah. So some people that I'm really inspired by and that we have a pretty deep partnership with are Mel and Cliff, the co-founders of Canva. This is the design software. They made a $100 million commitment to GiveDirectly last year, and we're on a really long-term kind of journey with them, because I know that they're extremely committed to this idea of everyone in Malawi having their most basic needs met. And they consider that a lifelong goal. They have, I think, pledged to give the vast majority of their wealth away, which includes a very, very, very significant portion of Canva, their equity in Canva. And that's something that they're working on in a way that I'm extremely inspired by. And there are a number of other people with similar levels of wealth that I see moving with a degree of intention and urgency to have as much impact as they possibly can in their lifetimes. And I think we need more people like that in the world, because I think it's
amen to that.
Totally. Because it's so easy to sit and here's the pattern that I see. You have people who generate extraordinary wealth. They're very successful founders or whatever, and they mean to do well. They have good intentions. They're like, I would like to have as much impact as I can. I would like to do good through this extraordinary success that I've had, which has come through hard work, but which also has come with an extraordinary amount of luck. And I want to do as much good as I can with that. But then they're busy running their company, and they're like, well, I want to make sure I do it well. And I don't feel like I have enough information or the right deal flow or the kind of infrastructure. And I don't want to build a bloody philanthropy institution. That sounds like a lot of work and a pain in the ass. And so I'm going to just wait until later in my life and when I have time and attention to kind of put towards it. And then with the best of intentions, with the core intention being hey, I want to do this well, but not having the time to then figure out how to do it well, you then have this self-perpetuating cycle where your underlying assets appreciate, people are getting wealthier, and so the decisions feel higher stakes. And so they're like, well, I can't give that much money away because I don't know enough about what I'm doing. And so the people that I am most inspired by are the people like Mel and Cliff, who have said, I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to assume that I can get perfection. This has to be something that I do in an ongoing way, because that's going to help me get smarter about how to do it well. And the need is now, and so I'm going to act with urgency now. And I wish that more people had that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are various sort of pledges and things that I believe exist out there about giving wealth away. But to your point, they all seem to be kind of putting everything on ice and maybe kicking that decision down the road. One day I will give away a large proportion of my wealth. It's well, that's all well and good, but the problems exist today. And I guess what I hear you saying is maybe there is no perfect way to deploy the capital, but it sounds like the fact that GiveDirectly has such a simple mechanism that is proved to work, hopefully kind of cuts that argument down at the knees, well,
certainly I hope so. And I certainly would be absolutely the person to say, I think there's a very, GiveDirectly and cash transfers, in some ways I think of it as the S&P 500 of giving. It is the index fund that very high confidence and very high scale is going to consistently deliver. Now, you could be a great hedge fund manager. You could be a great VC where you have the right deal flow and the right time and attention to find the perfect bets that are actually might, in individual circumstances, have higher upside than cash transfers or something like that. But that's going to take some combination of a lot of time and a lot of luck. And you've got to also be really good. And most people don't beat the market. And so, I'm an advocate of like a portfolio of giving. Like, I do think that people should be making some high risk, high return bets and like so on. But I think, cash transfers in some ways are a little bit like the S&P 500 of giving. I think it is reliably, consistently able to deliver impact at scale. And so I would make the case that it is a way to, in a low effort way, have a lot of impact. But even if someone wasn't giving cash transfers, I would still be making the case that it's an ongoing muscle to build. It's an ongoing practice to get into. Because if you don't, this self-perpetuating cycle of it always getting harder and never having enough time means that it's just going to wait forever.
I'm curious to turn our attention to, we talked a bit about the technology part of of GiveDirectly and some of the technologies that are enabling things like M-Pesa and movement of cash around the world. At this particular moment in time, we're obviously all living through this kind of brave new frontier of technology that is posing everyone hard questions about how do we organize ourselves, what are the new opportunities of today and tomorrow and 3 years from now. And I'm conscious that most of the analysis and the lens through which that gets looked at is primarily in some hierarchy, probably Silicon Valley, followed by other tech capitals around the world, and rarely, if ever, is it from the perspective of, I imagine, the kinds of countries where GiveDirectly is funneling lots of cash. So yeah, I'm just interested to get your perspective as you think about what is going on in the world right now and being close to these economies that operate very differently. How do you see what is happening? How do you see the impact emerging? What are the implications of this all for those kinds of countries, do you think?
I have both a lot of worry and a lot of optimism. I kind of hold these two things kind of simultaneously. And I guess like a lot of people who are like paying a lot of attention to how AI is unfolding have this combination of hope and optimism and fear and anxiety. The fear and anxiety, I think, comes from that the economic impacts and the labor market disruption that I think we have speculative fear of in places like the US or Europe, real and going to happen much faster in both low and emerging economies. There's a lot of speculation right now. What's AI going to mean for the future of software engineering? What's it going to mean for the future of entry-level jobs and positions in these developed economies? If you go somewhere like the Philippines, if you go other countries like that, where like a huge portion of the economy is actually driven by call centers, like that is not speculative, that those call centers are like facing catastrophic wipeout right now. And that has been a kind of step on the kind of ladder out of poverty that huge numbers of people around the world have been able to access. And that is probably going away. And so what is the future of like, is there a future of services-led growth? Or even honestly, like manufacturing-led growth in a world where you're able to kind of drive more automation more cheaply in global north countries? I don't think we know what the answer is, but that's where my fear is. Like, and when I talk to ministers in different countries around the world, like they are really grappling with this idea of what does the revolution mean for the future of job opportunities in our country, and how does it change how we're looking to upskill our young people? And I think they are more exposed and more vulnerable than countries like the US or places like Europe. And so that, I think, gives me some fear. The things that give me some optimism are that AI has the potential to empower hundreds of millions of people with access to things that they otherwise would never have gotten in a way that is another one of those leapfrog moments. So in rural sub-Saharan Africa, access to healthcare is a huge problem. Like there might be, one nurse or healthcare worker for tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people. And so the idea that you might actually have inside a really cheap smartphone, a diagnostic device that can guide you through healthcare decisions, that is an insane unlock from a healthcare perspective. The same is true for education, right? It's in places where access to education and quality teaching is so hard, having personalized tutors that have the ability to kind of unlock people's educational access in a way that is just totally different than what's happened before is an insane unlock. And so that I think is exciting. And that's even before we talk about the crazy levels of wealth that are being generated in the global north by people who are right on the inside of the kind of AI revolution, many of whom I think, do really have kind of values around, hey, let's make sure that people don't get left behind. And let's use AI, as long as we manage to avoid the catastrophic risks that might come with it, let's use it to try and create abundance for everyone. There is a huge amount of opportunity that comes with that to, use some of the wealth that's being generated to lift huge numbers of people out of poverty. And so I don't know where I land on all of that. Honestly, I think like many people, I'm kind of confused. It's some days I wake up on one side of the bed and I'm like, oh God, all of these jobs and what are we going to do about these economies? And then I wake up on the other side of the bed and I'm like, but holy shit, the access to healthcare and education and so on is amazing. And
I'm sure many people listening, certainly I can kind of hard relate to the almost the bipolar kind of nature of the world right now and swinging between those extremes. I'm curious. You mentioned there talking to ministers, and I imagine you're having conversations with leaders, with ministers and others in these parts of the world. As you say, it's too early to tell right now. I guess what we can see by the sounds of things is the eroding of these traditional ladders and pathways through which previous countries and communities have sort of trodden that path to become more prosperous. And I guess we're just too early to see what any kind of replacement might look like. But what's your sense from those kinds of conversations with ministers and governments and countries around the world? Are there any interesting examples, shining lights that have come to your attention of interesting, experimental, emerging things taking place?
Look, I don't think anyone thinks they have the answers, and the countries that I think are doing the most interesting things here, one, they're leveraging the most obvious opportunities around healthcare, around education, and things like that. They're saying, okay, there is a clear pathway to us radically increasing access to high quality healthcare. There is a pathway to radically increasing access to high quality education. Let's double down on that now because it's clear. Even if we are not 100% sure what the jobs of the future look like we can take that action now. Another one is actually entrepreneurialism. This is one of the things that is strikingly different actually about some of these developing economies, is that a greater portion of the economy is driven by informal and individual entrepreneurialism in ways that may actually end up making them more adaptive to kind of changes in the economy, because a huge portion of the country are already entrepreneurial. Whereas in, say, the US or in Europe, you've got a much higher proportion in these kind of stable, salaried positions that I think mean that people are actually less dynamic, actually, maybe in the way that they might respond if that job disappears. And so I think leaning into the kind of entrepreneurialism and supporting small business and so on and so forth, and saying we can't predict actually what the economy is going to need, but if we create the feedback loops, if we create the enabling environment for entrepreneurs to come up with their own opportunities and to adapt, then that is probably an unequivocally good thing. Rwanda is a country that I think is doing this really well, actually. Is I think they're thinking in a really smart long-term way about the opportunities and risks that come with AI. And so they're doing things like radically investing in overhauling their healthcare system to make it AI first, thinking a lot about education. I know that they're working with a bunch of the kind of model providers to basically make sure that it's as performant in the kind of local languages as it is in English. And I think that's like a good example of what I think smart countries are doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about you as a leader of obviously a big organization, lots of organizations now, going through that same set of questions, thinking about, well, what are the implications of the types of jobs we should be having, the way we should be organizing ourselves. Where are you guys on that curve? Like, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so we already use and have for some time used AI in our programmatic work. So I mentioned some of the ways in which we use big machine learning models. Like another thing that we do is we actually use disaster forecasting models that are getting increasingly accurate, actually. So we can actually identify before a disaster hits that it's going to hit and get support to people before the disaster hits to make them more resilient rather than after once they've already been hurt. It's like a little bit Minority Report, but in a good way. And we work with google.org on that because they've got these like really amazing models that allow us to identify with pretty good accuracy communities that are going to get flooded in the next week or places that are going to be hit by drought. And so that I think is like some really interesting and exciting applications of AI that are just like unequivocally good. And we've already been working with them in a bunch of our work. But then there's all of the kind of internal enablement and like workforce planning and things like that. And I try to keep GiveDirectly on the cutting edge of these things, but like everyone, it's hard to keep up with literally like models changing every week.
Of course.
My philosophy here is kind of in a few parts. It's like part one, enablement. Just like I want everyone in the organization to have access to all of the best tools as quickly as possible with no friction whatsoever. Part two is I really believe in bottom-up enablement here, which is like my ability to predict what are the best use cases or to kind of impose on a team certain like AI performance goals is pretty limited. And so I really believe in like find the people in the organization that are early adopters that are doing really cool experimentation and then just like give them resources, spotlight their work, allow them to be the kind of champions to identify the bottom-up opportunities within the organization. And so that's kind of part two. And then part three is to, in a more top-down way, identify what are the big opportunities that we have that probably are about fundamentally redesigning systems from an AI-first lens. It's unlikely that this will happen just through, bottom-up innovation because everyone's operating within a system that already exists. And so for us, that's in things like finance and compliance and legal and like various things where we're like, oh, we could totally reimagine how this is done in a way that is AI first, that is going to be far more agile, far more efficient, and higher impact as a result. And so we try and identify some of those strategic places. Obviously, one of those is going to be in software engineering as well, where we're like, we want to be AI first in like all of the software engineering that we're doing. So those are the kind of three parts that I think about there. But, everything changes every 2 months. So
Of course. Nick, I normally ask people to sort of round things out about kind of optimistic view of the future. I think we've already touched a little bit on that, optimism and some of the fears. So I'd be interested just to get your take on, imagine, you were able to collate, I don't know, the 100 wealthiest people in the world into one room and someone handed you a mic and said, right, Nick, you've got, 5 minutes to land, your 3 key points with this audience. What is it you would want to say to them?
We live at a time and in a moment in human history where we know more about doing good at scale than at any time in human history. The combination of technology, evidence and research, and capital allow us to, with credibility, take bets that can catalyze tens of millions of people out of extreme need and suffering and into a place of basic flourishing. And I think we just need people willing to take that bet. I can't say with certainty that it's going to work, but I can say we have pretty high confidence that it's got a good chance of working. And the and what an opportunity, like I am a bit of an optimist. You've probably got a bit of a sense of this, is that like I do see some of the big challenges, but fundamentally, like I'm pretty hopeful. Like over the last 30 years, more people have exited extreme poverty than at any time in human history. If you had to choose any day in all of history to be born and you didn't know where in the world you would be born, you would probably choose today. Like the world is on the whole getting better. I know that's like actually a pretty unpopular opinion, but when it comes to like living standards, when it comes to access to healthcare, like the likelihood that you get to live a long life, like the world is actually getting better. Now, I think we have an opportunity to dramatically accelerate that. And I think we have the tools, we have the evidence, we have the capital. Like we just need to start taking the bets. Like I'm a shots on goal guy. Let's take more shots on goal. And let's like screw the incremental stuff. The stuff that's like, yeah, we know it works, but like it's just kind of messing around the edges and on the margins. Like I'm here to kind of swing big or go home. And like I hope that there are some more people out there that are excited to take some of those swings as well.
Well, that seems like a great place to wrap us up. I hope, should that conversation ever take place, I hope those wealthy folks will hear you. Nick, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been great to dive into this together. So appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Seb. It's been great.